Hello, today this is July 22nd of 2026, and I'm going to review some materials that have come out yesterday from the Federal Register. The Federal Register is an official daily publication of the United States federal government, specifically the executive branch. It is where the federal agencies and the president formally publish rules, proposed rules, notices, and presidential documents such as executive orders and proclamations. I'm Malcolm McCallum. I hold a PhD in environmental sciences and have over 30 years experience teaching in higher education. I've covered science, law, policy, and both physical and the biological sciences. As an environmental scientist, my role is to educate, research, and inform about how the world of humans and the world of nature interact. The umbrella of this is called the socio-ecological world. The overarching purpose of the field of environmental sciences is to protect everyday people in the natural world from the rich and powerful. So I believe by just explaining what news items appear in the Federal Register, I'll be informing everyday people what the government is really doing, if they are working for you or someone else. Remember to hit the like button and subscribe so you'll always be in the loop with what they want hidden by distraction campaigns on TV and the radio. For the most part, I try to just tell you what is here. There isn't any, I'm not going to sit here and crack jokes or make this super entertaining. It is informative, straightforward, informative, and that's it. So moving right along, what I'm covering today is a series of actions that have taken place since my former, remember that 2 videos ago I released a review of the decision by the executive branch to remove the element of harm from the Endangered Species Act due to changes in habitat and stuff like that that's been around since the establishment of the act. There's already been at least 3 lawsuits filed against that announcement, and it's very likely that at least one of the judges may block it. So, I mean, how many of these other things that have happened are going to continue, I'm not sure, but it sure is a good idea if people comment if they support or refute if they support or reject what the administration is doing. This second wave of announcements, they are going to hit critical habitat, threatened species rules, Florida endemic species, white sturgeon, and the coastal California gnatcatcher, all of these under the new framework of the Endangered Species Act. So I'm just going to take an integrated approach rather than covering them all. The review is going to treat 6 announcements, 6 Federal Register actions as a single policy cluster because they are fallout from that previous decision. The 6 actions are not all direct legal consequences of the rule. They are, however, part of the same practical conservation question after habitat modification is less clearly treated as prohibited take. How much work must be carried by critical habitat, 4D rules, species-specific listings, habitat conservation plans, as well as public comment procedures. So this all came out yesterday on July 21st. So there are each of these documents. I'm going to read off the titles and where you can find them on the web, along with the contact information for the people who you leave comments with, and then I'll go over them. So if you don't want to hear this part right away, you can fast forward past to where I start talking about them. But the first is a series of regulations for designating critical habitat. This is released by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Department of Interior. It's called final. It's a final rule. It's 50 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 17. Its docket is FWS-HQ-ES-2025-0048 and RIN 1018-B176. This is a Federal Register document 2026-14629 and 91 Federal Register 45662-45683. It was published July 21st, 2026, and will become effective August 20th of 2026. So any comments or on either side of the argument need to go to John Turpak. He's the acting Assistant Director of Ecological Services. His phone number is 703-358-2163, and his email address is john_tirpak@fws.gov. The signer of this document is Brian R. Nesvik, the Director of Fish and Wildlife Services. And this information I'm giving you is posted in the Federal Register for the purpose of you to be able to contact and leave comments. I'm not like trying to drive political forces. I'm just informing you what they have there, and this is what they do. So let me go to the next 5 notices. Regulations pertaining to the endangered and threatened wildlife and plants. This is again U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Interior Final Rule 50 CFR Part 17, docket FWS-HQ-ES-2025-0029 and RIN 1018-BI74, I think that is. It's either an I or a 1. Federal Register document 2026-14633. And it's published as 91 FR 45723 through 45736, published July 21st of 2026 and effective again August 20th of 2026. These regulations, again, you contact the same person as the last one, and the signer's the same as the last one. Endangered species status for the Florida Keys mole skink. This was released by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the Department of Interior. Final Rule 50 CFR Part 17, docket FWS-R4-ES 2022-0104 and RIN 1018-BG24. This is a Federal Register document 2026-14636, published as 91 FR 45683-45697, published July 21st of 2026, effective August 20th of 2026. This one, the contact person is Nikki Colangelo, Classification and Recovery Division Manager, the Florida Ecological Services Field Office. Her number is 772-226-8138. Her email address is nikki_colangelo@fws.gov. The signer was Brian R. Nesvik again, Director of the Fish and Wildlife Service. The next item is endangered species status for key ring-necked snake and rimrock crown snake. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Department of Interior, Final Rule 50 CFR Part 17, docket FWS-R4-ES 2022-0022 and RIN 1018-BE84. It's Federal Register document 2026-14637, and it is published as 91 FR 45697-45723, published July 21st of 2026, effective August 20th of 2026. Again, this is Nikki Colangelo again, whose information I just gave you. The fifth document is 12-month finding for the San Francisco Estuary District population segment of the white sturgeon. Again, this is U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of Interior, notification of 12-month finding. Docket FWS-RA-ES-2026-2477. Published as Federal Register document 2026-14638, 91 FR 45750-45764. published July 21st, 2026, finding effective July 21st of 2026. So this is effective as of yesterday. The contact person is Heather Swinney, Acting Field Supervisor of the San Francisco Bay Delta Fish and Wildlife Office. Her phone number is 916-594-3646. Her email address is cawhitestergeon@fws.gov. The signer, again, is Brian R. Nesvik, Director of the Fish and Wildlife Service. The last document is the receipt of an incidental take permit application and proposed HCP Habitat Conservation Plan for the Los Angeles County Sanitation District Sewer Rehabilitation Project and Coastal California Gnatcatcher. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of Interior, notice of availability, request for comments. Docket FWS-R8-ES-2026-2708. Federal Register Document 2026-14680, 91 FR 45824-45826, published July 21st, 2026. Comments are due by August 20th of 2026 on this. And the contact person is Jonathan Snyder, Acting Field Supervisor of the Carlsbad Fish and Wildlife Office. His email address is JONATHAN_D as in dog _SNYDER@fws.gov. His phone number is 760-309-7993, and the signer of this one is Jonathan Snyder. All 6 items were listed in the July 21st, 2026 Federal Register issue. The 2 nationwide Endangered Species Act rules and the Florida Species Listing rules become effective August 20th, 2026. The white sturgeon item is a 12-month finding effective July 21st of 2026. And the Gnatcatcher Habitat Conservation Plan notice requests public comments by August 20th of 2026. I'm going to summarize all of these as a group policy action. The 6 July 21st actions can be understood as a second wave of endangered species implementation after the final rule rescinding the regulatory definition of harm. The harm rule narrowed the long-standing regulatory bridge between habitat modification and prohibited take. That makes the remaining habitat protection tools more important. In this second wave, Fish and Wildlife Service revises critical habitat exclusion rules, removes future use of blanket 4D rule for newly listed threatened species, lists 3 narrow-range Florida reptiles as endangered, finds the San Francisco estuary white sturgeon warrants listing but is precluded by higher priority actions, and opens comments on a low-effect habitat conservation plan for the coastal California gnatcatcher. The first 2 actions are nationwide regulatory changes. The critical habitat rule revises how Fish and Wildlife Service considers economic impacts, national security impacts, and the relevant impacts when deciding whether to exclude areas from critical habitat designation under the Endangered Species Act, Section 4B2. The 4D rule removes the future blanket rule option for newly listed threatened species, meaning future threatened species will not automatically receive a default set of endangered species-like prohibitions. Instead, the Fish and Wildlife Service will need to issue species-specific 4D rules in every case. The remaining 4 actions show how the nationwide rules play out at the species and project level. Florida Keys mole skink, the key ringneck snake, the rimrock crown snake are all narrow-range, habitat-dependent reptiles facing development, climate, sea level, storm, hydrologic, and habitat management pressures. San Francisco estuary white sturgeon is a long-lived aquatic species affected by overharvest history, harmful algal blooms, water operations, flow alteration, entertainment recruitment failure, poaching, and cumulative stressors. The Gnatcatcher Habitat Conservation Plan is a concrete example of the Endangered Species Act Section 10 permitting for habitat impacting infrastructure work. The net impact to critical habitat regulations of this rule makes exclusion analysis more formal and more openly weighted towards economic, national security, energy, and other non-biological impacts. In a post-harm environment, that is significant because the critical habitat becomes one of the remaining explicit federal habitat tools. The net impact of the threatened species 4D regulations involve future threatened species that will lose automatic blanket rule protection and become dependent on species-specific 4D rules. That can produce better tailoring, but can also create gaps and delays and weaker protections if species-specific rules are narrow and slow to issue. Now, it's important to realize that this is the rationale that they used for changing the harm definition in the first place, was that you could that perversion of the protections occurred. Well, what do you think is going to happen when you have weaker protections at the beginning and people know that stronger protections may come into effect later? Then they're all going to jump. Anybody who's uninformed or doesn't think this is important, or who has beliefs that might be contrary to species conservation, are going to act as quickly as they can, and that can cause the species to go extinct because we don't have the trigger to protect, and then withdrawal protections is needed. We're not putting them on unless someone proves they're needed, and that doesn't do much to help endangered species. The Florida Keys mole skink has a net impact in that the Fish and Wildlife Service moved from a proposed threatened listing to a final endangered listing after updated sea level rise and high tide flooding information indicated greater near-term risk. This is a strong example of a species for which habitat loss, coastal flooding, and climate vulnerability are central. The key ringed necked snake and the rimrock crown snake both snakes are listed as endangered because small fragmented populations and habitat loss leave little margin for error. The rule underscores the biological importance of pine rockland hammock, and associated Florida Keys South Florida habitats. The San Francisco estuary white sturgeon has a net impact in that the Fish and Wildlife Service finds that listing the DPS is warranted but precluded, so the species becomes a candidate rather than receiving immediate endangered species listing. Biologically, this creates a delay for the long-lived fish whose recovery depends on flow, recruitment, habitat connectivity, fishing management, and estuary health. The Coastal California Gnatcatcher Habitat Conservation Notice has a net impact in that the notice illustrates how incidental take permitting works after harm. The project would temporarily affect 1.71 acres, including 0.84 acre of coastal sage shrub used by gnatcatchers, with on-site restoration and 6 additional acres of off-site restoration proposed. These actions change previous policy. The general policy shift is from automatic to broad habitat protective rules toward more discretionary, case-by-case, and ecologically explicit regulatory mechanisms. The fact that you've got to do this for all these species means more paperwork. It also means that you've got to have more manpower to do the paperwork. However, our administration has downsized all of the people, so I don't really know how. I guess that by flooding it with paperwork and not having enough people to do it, this is going to create amazing gridlock that is going to cause bigger problems for everybody who is involved, whether they are people interested in having permissions to do things or people who are responsible for implementing the decisions. The prior Endangered Species Act harm definition made habitat modification legally relevant when it actually killed or injured listed wildlife by impairing essential behaviors. Once that pathway is narrowed, critical habitat Section 7 consultation, habitat conservation plans, state law, recovery plans, voluntary conservation, and species-specific 4D rules become very important. The critical habitat regulation changes policy by restoring a more structured role for economic, national security, and other impact analysis when the Fish and Wildlife Service decides whether to exclude an area from critical habitat. Now understand, it's not like these things weren't ever considered. They were actually considered very strongly and always have been. It's a mandate of NEPA that these things happen. It's a mandate of the Endangered Species Act that these things happen. It's just now the other thing has become weaker, so they take a more central role. The Fish and Wildlife Service describes this as transparency and predictability. Critics will read it as a pathway to remove biologically important areas where economic and energy development arguments are persuasive. Because critical habitat primarily affects federal actions through Section 7 consultation, the rule is most important where there is a federal permit, funding source, land management decision, or other federal nexus. The threatened species rule changes policy by eliminating the future blanket 4D rule option. Historically, Fish and Wildlife Service used the blanket rule that extended many endangered species prohibitions to threatened species unless the species-specific rule said otherwise. The 2019 Trump rule removed that future blanket approach. The 2024 Biden rule restored it. The 2026 final rule removes it again. Like we mentioned in the last document, when we were talking about the changes in the sizes of monuments, this is the same kind of thing. Big, wide policy swings that have no stability. Such things are harmful to the conservation of the species, but they're also harmful to all of the businesses and all the people who are in those regions who depend on knowing what the rules are. Business likes stability. If rules are strong, at least they know what the rules are. Here we've got rules swinging left and right every 4 years. This is not okay. And Congress really needs to do something about it, implement some darn laws that remove this ability to just swing things so dramatically. It really should not be this way. So moving on, the Fish and Wildlife Service says this aligns threatened species protections with the statute and with the National Marine Fisheries Service practice and promotes better species-specific tailoring. The practical change is that the future threatened listings depend more heavily on content, timing, and strength of individual 4D rules, which require people to write them, and that's a lot more paperwork. The Florida reptile rules do not relax protections. They add endangered species protections. They therefore cut against the idea that every post-harm ESA action is simply deregulatory. However, they are still relevant to the post-harm framework. And when I say post-harm, I'm talking about the change in the way that we define harm under the Endangered Species Act. However, they are still relevant from the post-harm framework because each species is habitat dependent and vulnerable to climate, development, hydrologic, fire management, and storm-related pressures. If habitat-based take liability is narrower, the listing rules, critical habitat, conservation partnerships, and state and local land use decisions become even more consequential. The white sturgeon finding is different again. A warranted but precluded finding acknowledges that the listing is justified but postponed by higher priority listing actions. That is not a biological declaration of safety. It is an administrative priority decision because they don't have enough people to do the work. That is not a biological. That is. In socio-ecological terms, this leaves the San Francisco estuary DPS in a liminal status, officially deserving endangered species listing, but without the full protections that a proposed and final listing would bring. The Gnatcatcher Habitat Conservation Plan notice is a project-level example of how endangered species permitting remains operational. It does not change national policy by itself, but it shows how a threatened species can still be addressed through Section 10 incidental take permitting, NEPA categorical exclusion screening, minimization, mitigation, on-site restoration, and off-site habitat restoration. That project-level machinery may become more important as the broad habitat as take protection is narrowed. The rationales for these actions are several. The administration's rationale for two nationwide rules rests on the statutory interpretation, predictability, energy policy, and regulatory burden. The Department of Interior stated that the Endangered Species Act regulation for forms advanced advance presidential directives on American energy independence, regulatory predictability, and alignment with the best reading of the law. The critical habitat rule is tied to explicit consideration of economic, national security, and other impacts. The 4D rule is tied to the argument that threatened species protection should be species-specific rather than automatic. The Fish and Wildlife Service also frames the critical habitat rule as a way to improve transparency. Under the Endangered Species Act 4B2, the Secretary may exclude areas from critical habitat if the benefits of exclusion outweigh the benefits of inclusion, unless the exclusion would result in extinction. The policy question is how much weight should be given to economics, energy, and national security, tribal interests, local governments, and other non-biological considerations. For the species-specific rules, the rationale is biological risk assessment. The Florida Keys mole skink final endangered determination rests on updated sea level rise and high tide flooding risk estimates, especially because many populations are in low-lying keys habitats. The two snake listings rest on the small ranges, fragmented habitat, development, fire suppression, sea level rise and saltwater intrusion, climate-related precipitation and temperature shifts, and storm events. For San Francisco estuary white sturgeon, the rationale is a status review conclusion that listing is warranted but precluded. This means the Fish and Wildlife Service concluded the DPS faces enough risk to deserve listing while delaying proposed listing because of higher priority ESA workload. Essentially, there aren't enough people to do the work that is necessary. The rule emphasizes multiple stressors, including overexploitation, harmful algal blooms, water operations, altered flows, entrainment, recruitment limitations, contaminants, poaching, and climate-related stressors. For the Gnatcatcher Habitat Conservation Plan, the rationale is permit by mitigation. The project repairs an existing underground sewer line to prevent leakage and associated damage to habitat and inhabited property. The Fish and Wildlife Service preliminarily concludes that the proposed incidental take permit and habitat conservation plan would individually and cumulatively have minor effects on the gnatcatcher and the human environment and may qualify as a low-effect categorical exclusion treatment. The viewpoints on this from Democrats and Republicans are varied. The political debate over these July 21st actions is very understood through the broader Endangered Species Act reform debate rather than a notice-specific speeches on each individual species. Notice there really aren't any responses to any of these by either Republicans or Democrats. They're not paying attention to the Federal Register. The Republicans probably know what's going on, and Democrats are not doing their job either, because neither of these it is incumbent upon a member of Congress to be oversight of executive branch actions, and the Federal Register is there to communicate these actions, and if they are not reading them, or someone in their office is not reading them, and they are not voicing positive, negative, or neutral opinions on them, then they are not providing oversight. I guess they're too busy on TV talking to the respective propaganda outlets, grandstanding and pretending they're doing something, because these things are not being attended to. I have, in almost every single one of these that I've done, I have very few comments from anybody who is in the Congress. So, I digress. National elected officials, administration officials, environmental groups, and state-aligned stakeholders have made clear statements about policy direction embodied by critical habitat and 4D rules. The species listing and habitat conservation plan notice are less partisan on the face, but they occur inside this broader political contest over how strong the Endangered Species Act habitat and threatened species protection should be. Republican and administration viewpoint on these is that the Trump administration and Interior Department framed the ESA regulatory changes as a correction of of overreach, a restoration of statutory limits, and a move toward regulatory predictability. The administration argues that automatic or broad protections can burden landowners, energy producers, infrastructure projects, and local economies. House Natural Resources Committee Chairman Bruce Westerman has argued more broadly that the ESA needs reform because litigation and expansive regulation have distorted the statute away from recovery and towards obstruction. Democratic conservation-oriented viewpoints are very different. Democrat and the conservation side arguments generally frame the same actions as weakening the legal safety net for habitat-dependent species. The argument is that eliminating the future blanket 4D protections and increasing critical habitat exclusions will create delays and gaps in protection, especially for species that are already declining when listed as threatened. The AP is reporting on July 2026 rule package notes, critics warn that future threatened species will need individualized rules, that economic analyses may make it easier to exclude habitat from critical designation. Don't forget that there are how many species in the United States? Are we going to do a habitat conservation? Are we going to do 4D rules for every single one of them? Especially when the administration is cutting people in these jobs, not proportionately providing avenues to do the work. It's just creating a lot more gridlock, which is bad for both the conservation and the business world and everyday people. There's nothing good about this decision when it comes to trying to get decisions made and having the government work as it should. Litigation and legal organizational viewpoints vary. The July 2026 harm rule has already generated litigation by environmental groups who argue that rescinding the long-standing definition of harm violates the Endangered Species Act, ignores precedent, and undermines habitat-based conservation. Remember that legislation cannot be changed by executive order or at all, or by agency personnel. It can't be. So if you are dropping an element of the Endangered Species Act because you don't like it or you disagree with it, then you are violating the law, at least the current interpretation of the law. Now that interpretation may change as it goes through the courts. And if it changes, then new laws will be needed to cover that and ensure that these protections occur, assuming that people want to protect species that are disappearing at a rapid rate. The legal conflict matters for these 6 actions because the same habitat protection architecture is at issue. If harm is narrower, then critical habitat and 4D rules become central battleground. Just like you, if you don't have a place to live, you die. If these organisms don't have a place to live, they die. Habitat is where they live. State and local dimensions of this issue are split. When we look at the actions, they create a split between the states and localities that seek more flexibility and those that depend on federal Endangered Species Act tools to restrain development or preserve habitat. For Florida endemic reptiles, local land use planning, county development decisions, fire management, storm adaptation, and conservation land acquisition are likely more important than partisan statements. For the gnatcatcher, the local issue is not ideology, but how to repair public infrastructure while maintaining coastal sage scrub habitat. The strongest scholarly argument for caution is that land use change, habitat loss, habitat fragmentation are all among the dominant drivers for biodiversity decline. Species become endangered because they don't have a place to live. Just like if you don't have a place to live, you will die. Recent syntheses identify land seed use change as leading direct drivers of biodiversity loss. This is directly relevant because the July 2026 Endangered Species Act reform package changes how habitat is protected under the Endangered Species Act. Critical habitat is legally and biologically important, but it is but its effect is bounded. Critical habitat identifies areas essential to conservation and triggers Section 7 consultation duties for federal actions. It does not create a general private land preserve and does not directly regulate actions without a federal nexus. Research and policy analysis have found that critical habitat can be valuable, but that independent effects may often be subtle and highly dependent on consultation context. This mixed evidence supports both sides. Conservationists are right that critical habitat can be an essential backstop after this recent change to the Endangered Species Act. Deregulatory advocates are also right. The critical habitat is not always the most direct and flexible recovery tool. The strongest scholarly argument supporting a narrower and more flexible approach to the perverse incentive is the perverse incentives literature. Luke and Michael found that evidence of preemptive habitat destruction associated with red-cockaded woodpecker restrictions suggesting that some landowners may degrade habitat to avoid regulatory constraints. There have also been other observations with other species where public comments have resulted in locals who are not very informed taking drastic actions that were not needed and ended up costing them money where it wouldn't have, because the actions that were needed would be very minor inconveniences, if even inconvenient. Sometimes it's just keep doing what you're doing and everything will be fine. In the case of the Illinois chorus frog in Arkansas, that really was the case. But everybody got scared and they went and paid a bunch of people a lot of money to level land and drove the species out of Arkansas for the most part. They're still up there, but they're even in worse shape than they were. So, I mean, these things happen across the board, but it's usually because of misunderstanding and disinformation that's circulated. And it's just the way it is. The strongest... Okay. It does, however, support a policy argument that durable conservation on private lands often requires incentives, certainty, safe harbor tools, and cooperative conservation rather than penalty exposure alone. And this is absolutely true, because but the problem is that all of these cooperative conservation programs, safe harbor tools, and incentives have had their budgets slashed and the personnel that do them removed so that they can't be implemented. This causes the landowners to believe that the government's just incompetent. In a way it is, because people who don't want this stuff going on have slashed the budgets to such a degree that they can't be implemented, making we expect the government to function better than businesses. Businesses take the cheapest way out to give the best product they can. The government is supposed to do what is necessary to do the job. And in some ways, not-for-profits also take this approach. Their approach is mission-driven, not financially driven. Get the job done, and I get a salary in the process. And it's just a different approach. Sometimes a business approach is great. Sometimes it's not. Social Security might be a good example. We expect Social Security to work, period. When you slash the budgets and remove personnel, they can't operate at the same level. Anyway, the strongest scholarly the legal background is equally important, though. The Endangered Species Act distinguishes endangered species, threatened species, critical habitat, Section 7 consultation, Section 9 take prohibitions, Section 10 incidental take permits, and Section 4D rules. The July 2026 rule package changes how those pieces interact. Harm is narrower. Critical habitat exclusion is more explicitly impact weighted, and future threatened species protections are more species specific. The result is not abolition of the ESA, but a significant redistribution of conservation burden across the statute. The biggest problem with this harm, and I haven't mentioned this before, is the idea of an umbrella species. The species that is going is become endangered or threatened is an indicator of the overall habitat condition. It is having problems because impacts on its world have changed. And the other organisms that reside in that world also are usually feeling the same things. But we can't go in and count every single little organism that plays a vital role in balancing our environment so that we don't succumb to it. It's actually very complex. I always hear on TV the simplest, on programs and so forth, the simplest answer is usually correct. That's actually kind of a misquote. It's because it's not the simple. Often it's very complex. It's the most obvious, or even that's not correct. Sir Occam's razor is really not a very good rule to just follow, unless you understand what the actual context of what he said is, if he even said it, okay? The most affected species are those whose survival depends on habitat integrity rather than protection from direct killing alone. That includes narrow-range coastal reptiles, coastal sage scrub birds, and estuarine fishes, whose recruitment and survival depend on the hydrologic and habitat conditions. These species are vulnerable because their threats are often cumulative, indirect, and landscape level. Sea level rise, high tide flooding, saltwater intrusion of freshwater bodies, development, vegetation change, storm intensification, altered flows, water flows, entrainment, harmful algal blooms, and fragmentation are all significant impacts on these things. The highest concern within the 6-item package is the Florida Keys mole skink. It's especially exposed because updated projections led the Fish and Wildlife Service to list the taxon as endangered rather than threatened. Its low-lying island habitat makes sea level rise and high tide flooding direct threats to its persistence. The key ring-necked snake and the rimrock crown snake are similarly exposed because both have small ranges and fragmented habitat and limited redundancy, ecological redundancy, and geographic redundancy. The San Francisco white sturgeon is a high concern aquatic case. It's vulnerable because it's long-lived and late-maturing. Population recovery responds slowly to stressors. A warranted but precluded finding delays listing even though the Fish and Wildlife Service acknowledged listing is justified. That delay is consequential where adult mortality, reduced recruitment, fishing impacts, harmful algal blooms, and water operations interact. The coastal California gnatcatcher is affected by the specific sewer rehabilitation project, but also illustrates the broader problem. The habitat conservation plan process can be responsible mitigation pathway, yet it depends on a reliable habitat restoration, biological monitoring, and enforcement commitments. The least directly affected species are those whose main threats are direct harvest, bycatch, trade, disease, or federal agency actions with clear Section 7 triggers that may be less directly affected by the harm critical habitat 4D combination than species whose primary threat is private and local habitat conversion without the federal nexus. From a socio-ecological perspective, these 6 actions matter because they connect law, land use, species biology, public infrastructure, water management, local government, federalism, and climate adaptation. The same action can look reasonable at one scale and risky at another. A species-specific 4D rule may be efficient, but across many species it can become a patchwork safety net. Critical habitat exclusions may help reduce economic conflict, but repeated exclusions can remove the very habitat needed for recovery. Never mind that the habitat might be something that adds beauty to the area and the rationale for why you have business from tourism in the first place. A habitat conservation plan may solve the infrastructure problem, but only if mitigation truly replaces lost ecological function. For the Florida Keys mole skink and the two Florida snakes, the socio-ecological system is coastal development, conservation land, fire management, storm risk, sea level rise, tourism economies, and local planning. For white sturgeon, it is water diversions, fisheries regulation, harmful algal blooms, river flow, estuarine ecology, delta governance, and long-lived fish demography. For the gnatcatcher, it is public sanitation infrastructure, golf course preserve mosaics, coastal sage scrub, endangered species permitting, and the community risk and sewer leakage. The key cumulative effect of these actions is governance fragmentation. The harm rule narrows the habitat as take. The critical habitat rule increases exclusion discretion. The 4D rule removes automatic future threatened species protections. Species-specific listings and habitat conservation plans can still protect wildlife, but they are more individualized and slower in the first place. That may be administratively precise, but it may also be less precautionary, especially for species already close to ecological thresholds and in severe danger of extinction. On a component-by-component impact assessment of these actions, for biodiversity, there's mixed to negative impacts in the aggregate. The three reptiles gain endangered species protection, and the white sturgeon is acknowledged as warranting listing. But the nationwide rules lower automatic threatened protections and make habitat exclusions easier to justify. The Florida reptiles gain protection, the white sturgeon remains a candidate, and the gnatcatcher receives protective project-level habitat conservation treatment. From a habitat perspective, the most important habitat protection shifts from broad take harm logic towards critical habitat, 4D, HCP, and Section 7 state law and voluntary conservation. Mole, skink, and snakes depend on scarce coastal South Florida habitats. The gnatcatcher depends on coastal sage scrub, and the sturgeon depends on flow and estuary habitat. From a climate resilience perspective, there's very high concern. Sea level rise, high tide flooding, storm intensification, altered hydrology, and warming interact with land use and species vulnerability. The mole skink and Hawaiian Florida style coastal taxa are especially exposed. White sturgeon is exposed to estuary warming, HAB, and flow stress. From federalism and local government, there's greater local and state importance because the federal habitat tools become more conditional. Florida county and local development, California water and fishery regulation, and Los Angeles County infrastructure decisions become more central. From a regulated community perspective, there's likely a positive for regulated entities seeking predictability, critical habitat exclusions, and less automatic threatened species regulation. The gnatcatcher Habitat Conservation Plan shows how infrastructure entities may still get permits through defined mitigation commitments. Tribes and public participation perspective, the procedural importance remains pretty high. Critical habitat exclusions, habitat conservation plans, public comment windows are now more important venues for influence, which is why you really need to look at the contact information above and voice what you think to the people who are the contacts. The gnatcatcher notice explicitly invites public and local, state, tribal, and federal agency comments. From a litigation and administrative burden perspective, this is going to explode. Okay, let's just make a spade a spade. High litigation risk and potential workload increase. Species-specific 4D rules may require more rulemaking effort than automatic blanket protection, and these people have cut everybody out of the service, so who's going to do it? Maybe we can ask for volunteers? This warranted but precluded sturgeon status may also invite scrutiny if delays persist. Overall, this package is not a simple rollback story, because some species gain protection, the Florida Keys mole skink, the key ringneck snake, the rimrock crown snake. Their final rules are genuine Endangered Species Act protective actions. The white sturgeon finding acknowledges serious risk, and the gnatcatcher notice shows that incidental take permitting and habitat conservation plans still operate. But the two nationwide rules change the architecture within which these species-specific decisions occur. The central conclusion is that the conservation floor is becoming more individualized, and it's frankly being lowered. After the harm rule, the critical habitat matters more. After the critical habitat rule, exclusions may become more important and more contested. After removal of the future blanket 4D rule, threatened species become more dependent on details of individual protective rules. The system can still work, but it still requires better science, faster species-specific rulemaking, stronger recovery planning, more transparent economic trade-off analysis, and more rigorous monitoring and whether mitigation actually protects ecological function. This is horrible for property owners too. Think about this. You're someone who runs a corporation and you want your to do have some action. You've got to look up every single action for every single species that you're going to encounter. Before you knew, there's an endangered species. We're going to have to deal with habitat conservation plans. We're going to have to deal with these certain things. Now there's going to be 5 billion little rules that you've got to follow. Good job. This doesn't streamline anything. It makes it a big, huge, giant mess of miscellany that you've got to go through, have lawyers go through every single darn one. This is not smart, in my opinion. But there are smarter people than me who may have a very brilliant reason for it, and if I ever find those, I'll be glad to recognize them. For a Federal Register, the July 21st ESA package shows the post-harm ESA taking shape. Some individual species receive protection, but the broader regulatory structure shifts away from broad precautionary habitat protection and towards narrower, case-by-case, economically explicit, and more politically reversible tools. That's it for this issue of my reviews. Please, if you're interested, go back to the beginning of this video and check out the contact information, or look up the individual actions in the Federal Register, and feel free to contact the individuals who are there waiting for you to deliver your comments. Have a very nice day.